Hello students, today we will discuss about diplomacy as a concept in international relations. We will be proceeding like this. First we will look at the background of diplomacy, then we will talk about the meaning of diplomacy, then we will discuss about the nature and purpose of diplomacy, then we will discuss about the aims and objectives of diplomacy. So let us start our discussion with the background of diplomacy. Diplomacy has probably existed for as long as civilization has. Lord Hanuman and Lord Krishna were the best diplomats of their time. If you look at them from the perspective of diplomacy, you will find that what situation they were in, what mission they were given, how they handled that situation, all these are examples of good diplomatic practices. Hanumanji had gone ahead with a mission to find Goddess Sita. He contacted her, set Lanka on fire, so that in that sense he was a multi-purpose diplomat. So if you find any qualities of a good diplomat, you will find all these good qualities with Lord Hanuman. Maybe it is about communication, maybe about it is patience, maybe about about perseverance, on all the qualities he was a good diplomat, and that's why there are a lot of qualities the modern diplomacy can get lessons from the way Hanumanji acted as a diplomat. Similarly, during the Kurukshetra war, Lord Krishna embarked on a mission as a peace envoy, venturing into the heart of the battlefield, that symbolized the importance of proactive diplomacy, direct engagement and the pursuit of peace even in the hub of the turmoil. So if you look at the personality of Lord Krishna, his role in the Mahabharata war, the way he tried to avert the war, before the war, during the war, even after the war, he played a very important diplomatic role. So there are a lot of things that is associated with the personality of Lord Krishna, and particularly his diplomatic side of his personality, that is of great importance to modern diplomacy. Historians have shown that the Indians, Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, Arabs and the Chinese, they have immensely contributed towards the evolution of the art of diplomacy in the ancient period, when the first form of diplomacy such as the envoys, treaties and alliances were practiced. So if you look at the documented historical examples, you will find many more examples existed during the ancient period, maybe with different civilizations, but they all focused on the role of envoys, the importance of treaties, the importance of alliances. So they are all important for understanding diplomacy in international relations. Diplomacy also developed and diversified in the medieval and modern times, when the rise and fall of various states and empires, the emergence and the spread of various religions and ideologies, and the discovery and colonialization of various regions and continents, that shaped and reshaped the international system and the actors in it. So the point is, there is not a single region that affected diplomacy that has influenced modern diplomacy, but there are so many regions. We can borrow so many ideas from religious texts like Ramayana, like Mahabharata, like Quran, like Bible. So these are important sources of information about diplomacy. And besides the religious text, there are also some historical examples how diplomacy was practiced in different civilizations, how collectively together they contributed what we have the modern practice of diplomacy. Later, World War I, which was blamed on diplomats conducting the old diplomacy, and the establishment of the League of Nations, the United Nations in 1945, the decolonization process that started after the Second World War, all contributed to the art of diplomacy, leading to the process of its codification at Vienna Convention in 1961, that highlighted the relevance of the art of diplomacy in modern international relations. So there is not a single factor, there are so many factors, there are so many issues, there are so many events that collectively together influence the way we practice modern diplomacy. So no continent can claim its exclusive hold over the knowledge on diplomacy. Rather, there are Indians, there are Chinese, there are Iranians, there are Romanians, there are so many. So those who have contributed for enrichment of diplomacy as a practice, as a norm, as a tool, as a concept in international relations. Now let us focus on the meaning of diplomacy. The concept of diplomacy is basically derived from the Greek word diploma, which means to fold. In Latin language, the word diplo plus ma meant folded into and also an object respectively. As in Roman Empire, diplomas were permits issued to foreigners to pass from one particular territory to another territory. In a broad sense, diplomacy is the entire process through which states conduct their foreign relations. It is also the means for allies to cooperate and for adversaries to resolve their conflict without force. So it serves two main purposes. So for friends, it serves the purpose of cooperation, and for adversaries it is the means to resolve the conflict without force. States communicate, bargain, influence one another and also adjust their differences through diplomacy. The routine business of international affairs is also conducted through the peaceful instrument of diplomacy. So in that way you can say that diplomacy is one of the best way through which, or one of the best method through which states communicate and influence each other, and also this is the instrument through which they resolve their differences. In a more narrow sense, diplomacy is the implementation of a country's foreign policy as distinct from the process of policy formation. Diplomats may influence the policy, but their main target is to negotiate with the representative of other countries. So in a narrow sense, you can understand that diplomacy is all about the implementation of foreign policy, but this is not actually correct. They are also involved in the process of policy formation. In that way, they influence the policy, but their main intention, the main work is to negotiate with the representative of other countries. Jayant Bandyopadhyay defines diplomacy as the science of conducting the foreign relations of a state with a view to promoting its national interests. So it is something like an art. It's a science of conducting the foreign policy of a nation, and the objective is to promote your national interest. According to Berich, diplomacy is an essentially political activity, well resourced and skillful, a major ingredient of power. So in that way, we discussed the elements of national power, in which we discussed what is the role of a quality diplomacy or the role of quality diplomats that can add to your national power. So in similar way, Berich defines diplomacy as a kind of political activity, and if you have a skillful and a resourceful diplomacy, that adds to your national power, and it also helps you to secure your objectives of foreign policy without resort to force, propaganda or law. So that is how it's a kind of broad definition given by Berich. Now let us discuss about the relationship of diplomacy with different theories of international relations. The relationship between international relations theories and diplomacy has largely been one of mutual neglect. Whereas liberalism put more trust in international law and international organization than in diplomacy as the vehicle to achieve lasting peace in international relations, in realism, diplomacy is included among others and is dependent on other material state capabilities. So, the liberals particularly focused on international organization, international law, and they have not much dealt with diplomacy as a tool, as a practice, although this the establishment of international organizations later on encouraged the emergence of what is called conference diplomacy. But anyway, as a theory, liberals were not much worried about diplomacy, they were not bothered much about diplomacy, rather they thought that international relations can be improved, international politics can be reformed through international law and international organization. Similarly, the realists, Morgenthau, although considered diplomacy as an important part of interstate relationship, but the realists were more concerned about the state's material capabilities rather than diplomacy. The neo-realists insist that there is an unavoidable dynamic to international politics which persists whether we like it or not. Basically, I am talking of Walter's theory of structuralism. States and their diplomacy will always exist because people live in a law-governed natural universe that constrain their possibility. So, basically he is talking of the concept of anarchical nature of the structure of international relations, where you do not have much possibilities. So, in that way diplomacy has a very limited role according to Walters. The constructivists in contrast suggest that the social world is much more produced by the way we think about it than people actually realize. So, for the constructivist, diplomacy is not something given, it is something socially constructed. So, the way we think about the world, we think about the reality, that has a bearing on diplomacy. Sovereign states and the sorts of diplomacy associated with them exist only insofar as people accept the claim they do. So, long as there is nation state, there may be diplomacy, but once there is no nation state, diplomacy may lose its importance. In principle, at least, people could consciously think and act themselves in an entirely different set of social relations in which the claims of state sovereignty would no longer be accepted, and diplomacy as their privileged form of intercourse would also fade into irrelevance. The point is, so according to the constructivist, the way we understand the state, the way we understand interstate relations, the way we understand diplomacy, they will remain valid till we understand them in that way. But if we change our understanding of diplomacy and state interaction, definitely state will lose their sovereignty, and so also diplomacy. So, the constructivists do not accept the views of realists on diplomacy. Now, let us discuss about the nature and purpose of diplomacy. Diplomacy is often confused with foreign policy, but they are different from each other. Diplomacy is the main but not the only instrument of foreign policy, which is set by political leaders, though diplomats may advise them. So, there is a relationship between diplomacy and foreign policy, and diplomacy is basically a tool for serving the interest of foreign policy. So, it is not the same as foreign policy, and foreign policy is formulated by the political leaders, though the diplomats may help them to formulate the better policy. Foreign policy establishes the goals, prescribes the strategies, and sets the broader tactics to be used in their accomplishment. It may also employ secret agents, subversion, war, and other forms of violence, as well as diplomacy to achieve its objective. So, there are so many tactics the states can use. So, diplomacy is understood as one of the tactics, one of the tools for achieving the foreign policy objective of a nation. Diplomacy is the principal substitute for the use of force. It means so long as there is diplomacy, or if diplomacy is successful, there is no possibility of war. War starts when diplomacy fails. It may be coercive, backed by the threat to apply punitive measures or coercive measures, but it is mainly non-violent. Its primary tools are dialogue and negotiation, primarily conducted by accredited envoys and other political leaders. So, basically diplomacy, sometimes it is peaceful, sometimes it is violent, but basically it is non-violent in the sense that it believes in dialogue and negotiation, primarily conducted by the trained diplomats and envoys and other political leaders. So, diplomacy is not just related to the envoys and the trained diplomats. The politicians, they can also act as diplomats or as the negotiators. Unlike foreign policy, which is generally articulated publicly, most diplomacy is conducted in confidence. So, sometimes foreign policy is conducted openly, but diplomacy is conducted secretly, because you have to keep confidentiality, otherwise there may be problem in negotiation. The purpose of diplomacy is to strengthen the nation state or the organization it serves in relations to other by advancing their interests. So, the purpose of foreign policy, the purpose of diplomacy, they may be same, but diplomacy is not the same as foreign policy, because the main purpose of diplomacy is to strengthen the nation state, to serve its interest, and it also in a way helpful in advancing the interest of the country or the organization it serves. It habitually strives to preserve peace. Diplomacy is strongly inclined towards negotiation to achieve agreements and resolve issues between the states. So, basically diplomacy is based on negotiation to achieve some agreements, to achieve some issues, or to resolve some issues between and among the sovereign countries. So, even in peaceful times, diplomats may use coercive threats of economic or other punitive measures, to impose a kind of unilateral solution to a dispute, maybe by the application of military force. So, sometimes it is used as a threat, if you do not do, then you will be punished. So, in a way that gives the signal, that gives the message to the other party that they have to follow this, or they will be helpful for achieving the objective of the stronger party. However, diplomacy normally seeks to develop goodwill towards the state it represents, nurturing relations with foreign states and people that will ensure their cooperation or their neutrality. So, basically, the diplomats are mainly interested for developing good relationship or goodwill towards the state they represent, and also they want to nurture good relationship with other countries and people, and to ensure their cooperation at the time of the need, and even if they do not extend their cooperation in the time of crisis, at least they will maintain neutrality in that situation. When diplomacy fails, war may start, thus goes the saying. However, diplomacy is useful even during the war, that we have discussed during the example of Lord Krishna, how he played an important diplomatic role before the war, during the war, and after the war. If it conducts the passage from protest to peril, dialogue to negotiation, ultimatum to refusal, and war to peace and reconciliation with other states. Diplomats are the primary practitioners of diplomacy. They are specialists in carrying messages and negotiating adjustments in relations and the resolution of quarrels between states and the people. So, it is mainly on the quality of the diplomats, whether you have much cooperation with the neighboring countries or with the other countries, that depends a lot, So, in that way the diplomats are the primary practitioners of diplomacy, and they particularly carry message and negotiate with the other countries on the resolution of disputes and the quarrels between the countries and the people. Their weapons are words backed by the power of the state or organization they represent. So, when they say something, it is not taken lightly, because they are backed by their state, they are backed by the state power. So, in that way, their weapon are words, they do not use the sword, they do not use the gun, rather whatever they say, because they are the accredited representative of the state. So, their words are taken seriously by the other parties. Diplomats help the leaders to understand the attitude and actions of other countries and develop strategies and tactics to deal with them. So, basically the diplomats, they help the leaders to understand the attitude and actions of the other party, the foreign country, and in that way they help the leaders to formulate better practices, to formulate better policies to deal with them. Thus, the wise use of diplomacy is a key to successful foreign policy. So, if you have a successful diplomatic staff, if you have good quality diplomats, so your foreign policy would definitely be successful. because most of the time, if the policies are not successful, to some way it is related to your poor quality of diplomatic staff. So, in that way diplomacy contributes for the attainment of foreign policy objectives in a much more systematic and nuanced way. So, it is not an immoral act, rather it is a machinery for action that acts through standard procedures, settled procedures in both the bilateral and multilateral forums. Diplomacy has two phases. It is the vehicle through which a state asserts itself and represents its concerns to the world. So, in that way, diplomacy is very important, because it is through the diplomats the state will assert itself internationally and it represents its concerns to the world. So, in a way they are the best messengers, So, it is up to the messenger to take the message, to present the message in such a way that it is acceptable to others, it is considered as legitimate to others. So, in that way the state uses the diplomats to present its concerns, to present its views to the world. Second, it is also one of the principal means for reconciling competing national interests. So, if there are different kinds of interests, it is the diplomats who can reconcile those conflicting interests. So, it all depends on the diplomats. So, they not only take the message of their country to the world, communicate the message of their country to the world, rather they also are instrumental in reconciling irreconcilable differences or very competing kind of national interest between the countries. In other words, diplomacy aims to further a state's particular goals while preserving international order. So, the main task of the diplomat is to advance their country's interest, to advance their country's foreign policy goals, while they try to maintain the international order. It is also a tool that the states use to get their way without creating the animosity of other states. So, in that way diplomacy is used to resolve the differences, to bring two conflicting parties to the negotiating table and arrive at a mutually acceptable solution. Diplomats must constantly balance the need to protect their state's interest and to avoid conflict with other states. Their main purpose is not to play politics, rather their main purpose is to balance their country's own interest along with the interest of other countries, and to play an important role so that it avoids the conflict with other countries. So, you have to secure your own country's interest without inviting trouble, without creating enmity, without creating conflict with other countries. So, that is the main objective of diplomacy. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. We discussed that diplomacy is crucial in international relations as it facilitates peaceful resolution of conflicts, promotes cooperation and fosters understanding among the nation states. Diplomacy's evolution reflects the increasing interdependence among the states and the growing complexity of global issues, highlighting its role in promoting stability, negotiation, and consensus building in an interconnected world. Diplomacy can be understood both from the broad and narrow perspective. In its broadest sense, diplomacy refers to the overall practice and conduct of international relations between the states and other actors on the global stage. It encompasses not only traditional state to state diplomacy but also economic, cultural, public, and multilateral diplomacy. In a narrow sense, diplomacy specifically refers to the formal and structured process of conducting relations between the states through accredited diplomats and diplomatic missions. Then we discussed the relationship between international relations theories and diplomacy. Liberalism, for instance, emphasizes diplomacy as a means to foster cooperative relationship, promote international institutions, and resolve conflicts through negotiation and dialogue rather than coercive means. Realism in international relations theory views diplomacy primarily as a tool for maximizing national interests enhancing security through alliances, and managing power dynamics in an anarchical international system. Constructivism posits that diplomacy is shaped by socially constructed norms, identities, and perceptions influencing state interactions and the evolution of international relations over time. The nature of diplomacy encompasses the art and the practice of conducting formal relations between states and other international actors through peaceful means, through negotiation, dialogue, representation, and the exchange of information. Its purpose is to promote national interest, foster cooperation, prevent conflicts, and build trust through dialogue, negotiation, and the establishment of diplomatic norms and protocols. Thank you very much for your attention. We will cover the remaining part of diplomacy in the next lecture. Thank you once again.